The sound of gunshots echoed through Kelton, Utah's dusty Main Street, sending a flock of startled birds into the clear blue sky as Penelope Taylor clutched her reticule tighter to her chest. She'd only meant to deposit her meager earnings from the schoolhouse before returning to grade papers. But fate had other plans on this sweltering summer day in 1879. Penelope quickened her pace, the hem of her practical blue cotton dress kicking up small clouds of dust as she hurried toward the Kelton Savings and Loan. At 24, she'd been the town's schoolteacher for nearly 3 years, having arrived on the westbound train with nothing but her teaching certificate, a trunk of belongings, and dreams of independence far from her family's crowded Boston home. The bank stood proudly on the corner, its brick facade a stark contrast to the wooden structures that lined most of Kelton's Main Street. As Penelope approached, she noticed nothing unusual, just Mr. Finley sweeping the boardwalk outside his general store and Mrs. Winters hanging laundry behind her husband's barber shop. Inside the bank, cool air provided blessed relief from the Utah summer heat. Only 3 other customers were present. Elderly Mr. Patterson discussing his cattle investments with the manager, young Mrs. Cooper with her infant asleep in her arms, and a well-dressed stranger Penelope didn't recognize, his back to the door as he approached the teller's window. "Good afternoon, Miss Taylor," called Henry Wilson, the bank clerk who always seemed to blush whenever she entered. "Here to make your usual deposit." Penelope nodded and smiled, stepping into line behind the stranger. She noticed his expensive but dust-covered clothes, suggesting he wasn't from Kelton. Something about his rigid posture made her uneasy, but she dismissed the feeling as uncharitable. Newcomers weren't uncommon in their growing railroad town. The stranger reached the teller's window, and what happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. He pulled a revolver from beneath his coat and aimed it directly at the frightened teller. "Nobody move," he shouted, his voice eerily calm. "This is a robbery. Everyone on the floor now," Mrs. Cooper gasped, clutching her baby tighter as Mr. Patterson slowly lowered himself to his knees, arthritis making his movements painful and deliberate. "You," the robber pointed his weapon at Penelope. "Come here. You're my insurance." Before she could react, he grabbed her arm, yanking her against him and pressing the cold barrel of his revolver against her temple. The metallic smell of the gun mingled with the robber's sweat and tobacco. "Fill the bag," he ordered the teller, throwing a canvas sack onto the counter with his free hand while maintaining his grip on Penelope. "No funny business or the schoolmarm gets a bullet." Penelope's heart hammered so violently she feared it might burst from her chest. She'd faced unruly students and the scorn of certain townspeople who found her modern ideas about education too progressive, but nothing had prepared her for the terror of being used as a human shield. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's no need for shut up." The robber tightened his grip, causing her to wince in pain. "Nobody needs to get hurt if everyone does exactly what I say." The teller's shaking hands fumbled with cash drawers as he stuffed bills and coins into the bag. Outside, life in Kelton continued unaware of the drama unfolding inside the bank. Then the door swung open. A tall figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight stepped into the bank, stopping abruptly as he assessed the situation. Penelope recognized him immediately. Nathan Vance, owner of the largest cattle ranch outside Kelton. He was a man of few words who rarely came to town except for supplies or business matters. Though she'd exchanged pleasantries with him on occasion, they'd never shared more than brief conversations about the educational needs of the ranch hand's children. Well, the robber sneered, shifting his position to face the newcomer while keeping Penelope firmly in front of him. Looks like we have a hero joining our little party." Nathan's expression revealed nothing, but his eyes, piercing blue beneath the brim of his weathered hat, locked with Penelope's. Something in that gaze steadied her, even as the robber's arm tightened around her waist. "I'm just here on business," Nathan said evenly, his hands visible at his sides. "Seems I've come at a bad time." "On the floor with the others," the robber ordered, gesturing with his gun. Nathan didn't move. Instead, he calmly assessed the room, noting the positions of the other hostages and the growing paleness of Penelope's complexion as fear threatened to overwhelm her. "I said on the floor." The robber's voice rose, echoing against the marble counters. "Mister," Nathan replied, his voice steady, "I don't take kindly to men who threaten women. Why don't you let the lady go? Take whatever money they've given you and ride out while you still can." The robber laughed, a harsh sound that made Penelope flinch. "And who's going to stop me?" "You." "I've got the gun and the girl." What happened next occurred so quickly that Penelope would later struggle to recall the exact sequence. The robber shifted his weapon toward Nathan, momentarily loosening his grip on her. In that split second, Nathan's hand moved to his holster, drawing and firing in one fluid motion before the robber could adjust his aim. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The robber's grip on Penelope released as he staggered backward, a look of surprise frozen on his face as he collapsed to the floor, clutching his shoulder where Nathan's bullet had struck him. Nathan crossed the room in 3 long strides, kicking the robber's fallen weapon away before checking that the man was incapacitated but alive. Only then did he turn to Penelope, who stood trembling, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you hurt, Miss Taylor?" he asked, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. Unable to speak, she shook her head, then swayed on her feet as the reality of what had just occurred washed over her. Nathan caught her elbow, steadying her as shouts and running footsteps announced the arrival of Sheriff Davis and his deputy. "Someone heard the shot," the sheriff explained, surveying the scene with practiced efficiency. "Vance, I might have known you'd be in the middle of this." As the deputy secured the wounded robber and the sheriff began taking statements from the shaken witnesses, Nathan guided Penelope to a chair, his calloused hand still supporting her elbow. "Deep breaths," he advised quietly. "It's over now." Penelope nodded, trying to compose herself. She was mortified by her reaction. She'd always prided herself on being level-headed in a crisis. Yet here she was, trembling like a leaf while Nathan Vance, a man who spent more time with cattle than people, displayed perfect composure. "Thank you," she finally managed. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Reckon you'd have been fine. You've got more backbone than most men I know, Miss Taylor. Teaching 20 youngsters takes more courage than facing down one outlaw." His unexpected compliment brought warmth to her cheeks. Before she could respond, Sheriff Davis approached to take her statement. "I'll need to document what happened here, Miss Taylor," the sheriff said, notepad in hand. "When you're feeling up to it." Nathan stood. "I can take Miss Taylor over to the doctor to make sure she's all right first." "I'm perfectly fine," Penelope protested, rising to her feet to prove her point, only to find her knees uncooperative. Nathan's hand was immediately at her elbow again, steadying her. "Doctor first," he insisted. "Sheriff later." Sheriff Davis nodded his agreement. "Good thinking, Vance. I'll be by Doc Miller's office in an hour or so. That scoundrel isn't going anywhere except to my jail once the doc patches him up." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Nathan escorted Penelope to the doctor's office. Curious townspeople had gathered, drawn by news of the excitement, and Penelope felt their stares as she walked beside the tall rancher. Everyone's looking, she murmured, embarrassed by the attention. Let them look, Nathan replied matter-of-factly. Nothing wrong with being alive to be looked at. His straightforward perspective cut through her embarrassment. He was right after what had just happened. Worrying about gossip seemed remarkably trivial. At the doctor's office, Nathan insisted on waiting while Dr. Miller examined her and declared her physically unharmed but suffering from shock. The doctor prescribed rest and a mild sedative, which Penelope reluctantly accepted. I should return to the schoolhouse, she said as she rejoined Nathan in the waiting area. I have papers to grade. Nathan's expression was incredulous. Papers can wait, Miss Taylor. You need rest. The children will understand if their assignments are returned a day late, he finished for her. I'll escort you home. The firmness in his tone brooked no argument, and truthfully, Penelope was relieved. The thought of being alone in her small house behind the schoolhouse suddenly seemed unbearable. As they walked the short distance to her home, Penelope became acutely aware of Nathan's presence beside her, the subtle scent of leather and pine, the confident stride that somehow adjusted to match her shorter steps, the watchful gaze that continuously scanned their surroundings as if expecting further threats. Do you always carry a gun, Mr. Vance? She asked, partly to distract herself from the lingering fear and partly out of genuine curiosity. Out here it's necessary, he replied, though I prefer not to use it. You didn't hesitate today. Nathan glanced down at her, his expression solemn. Some decisions don't allow for hesitation, Miss Taylor. At her doorstep, Penelope fumbled with her key, her hand still not entirely steady. Without comment, Nathan gently took the key and unlocked her door, pushing it open and checking inside before stepping back to let her enter. Thank you again, she said, standing awkwardly in her doorway. For everything, he nodded, touching the brim of his hat. I'll check on you tomorrow if that's all right. Make sure you're recovering. The offer surprised her. Nathan Vance wasn't known for social calls. That's very kind but unnecessary. Nonetheless, he said with quiet determination, I'll be by. As she watched him walk away, Penelope realized that the terrifying events of the day had revealed aspects of the reserved rancher she'd never noticed before: a quickness of thought, an unwavering sense of duty, and a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. That night, despite Dr. Miller's sedative, Penelope's sleep was fitful, haunted by dreams of the robber's gun pressed against her temple and the thunderous sound of Nathan's shot. She woke several times in a cold sweat, half expecting to find herself still in the bank with the robber's arm around her waist. By morning, exhaustion had left dark circles beneath her eyes, but she was determined to return to her duties. Her students needed consistency, and teaching would provide a welcome distraction from replaying yesterday's events in her mind. She had just finished dressing when a knock at her door startled her. Through the window, she glimpsed Nathan's tall figure on her porch, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. When she opened the door, he studied her face with concern. You didn't sleep. Good morning to you too, Mr. Vance, she replied, attempting a lightness she didn't feel. And I slept perfectly well, thank you. His raised eyebrow made it clear he didn't believe her. I've brought breakfast, he said, holding up a basket. Mrs. Fleming at the hotel packed it when I mentioned I was checking on you. The gesture was so unexpected that Penelope found herself at a loss for words. In Boston, such an early morning call would have been scandalously improper, but frontier towns operated under different social codes. Still, Nathan Vance bringing her breakfast would certainly set tongues wagging. Her hesitation must have been evident, for he added, I can leave it and go if you prefer. No, she decided impulsively. Please come in. I was just making coffee. Her small home consisted of a combined kitchen and sitting area, with a bedroom and study partitioned off at the back. It was modest but meticulously neat, with bookshelves lining one wall, her most precious possessions. Nathan looked too large for the space, his broad shoulders and height making her furniture seem dollhouse-sized. He set the basket on her table and removed his hat, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. "I don't often receive visitors," she explained, gesturing for him to sit while she poured coffee into her two best cups. "Particularly not for breakfast." "I don't often make social calls," he countered with unexpected humor. "Particularly not with baskets." His response surprised a genuine laugh from her, the first since the robbery. "Then we're both venturing into unfamiliar territory, Mr. Vance." "Nathan," he corrected. "After yesterday, I think we can dispense with formalities." Penelope nodded, testing the name. "Nathan, and I'm Penelope." The breakfast Mrs. Fleming had packed was generous freshly baked biscuits, ham, preserves, and even 2 slices of apple pie. As they ate, Penelope found herself telling Nathan about her life in Boston, her decision to take the teaching position in Kelton, and the challenges of adjusting to Western life. "My parents thought I was mad to come west," she admitted. "They still write weekly letters imploring me to return to civilization." "Do you ever regret it?" Nathan asked, his blue eyes intent. "Coming here," Penelope considered the question seriously. "There are comforts I miss. Hot baths whenever I want, theaters and libraries. The changing season's real autumn with colored leaves, not just this slow fade from hot to cold." She sipped her coffee. "But no, I don't regret it. There's a freedom here I never had in Boston." "Freedom comes with risks," he observed, "like bank robberies." She smiled wryly. "Among others." He hesitated, then added, "I admire what you've done with the school. Those children are lucky to have a teacher who cares enough to leave comforts behind for their education." His compliment warmed her more than it should have. "And what about you? Have you always been in Kelton?" Nathan shook his head. "Came west after the war. Worked as a ranch hand in Texas, then trail boss. Saved enough to buy land here 10 years ago when the railroad was pushing through." Penelope realized she knew very little about the man who had saved her life. Town gossip held that he was wealthy but uninterested in social niceties, competent but taciturn, fair to his workers but demanding. Nothing had prepared her for this thoughtful man sitting at her breakfast table. Their conversation flowed easily until the schoolhouse bell rang in the distance, signaling it was time for classes to begin. Nathan rose immediately, understanding her responsibilities without needing to be told. "Thank you for breakfast," she said as she walked him to the door. "It was unexpectedly pleasant." "Maybe we could make it somewhat expected in the future," he suggested, a question in his eyes. Penelope felt a flutter of something unfamiliar. "I think I might like that." As Nathan left, Penelope watched him stride down the path, aware that something significant had shifted between them. The thought both thrilled and unsettled her as she gathered her teaching materials and headed to the schoolhouse. Throughout the day, she found her thoughts drifting to Nathan's blue eyes and the confident way he had handled the crisis at the bank. Her students noticed her distraction, exchanging curious glances when she lost her place in a reading or stared thoughtfully out the window. "Miss Taylor, are you thinking about Mr. Vance?" asked 8-year-old Emma Carter during arithmetic lessons, causing the older children to giggle and Penelope to blush furiously. "I'm thinking about whether you've completed your multiplication tables, Emma," she replied with as much dignity as she could muster, "and wondering who's been gossiping to children about yesterday's events." "Everyone's talking about it," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Pa says Mr. Vance shot that bad man dead as a doornail to save you. Your father is mistaken." Penelope corrected firmly. The man was wounded, not killed, and is currently in Sheriff Davis's custody. Now, back to mathematics, please. After school, Penelope stayed late grading assignments, partly to catch up on work she'd neglected and partly to avoid the curious stares of townspeople. When she finally emerged, the sun was setting, painting Kelton's dusty streets gold and crimson. To her surprise, Nathan was waiting, leaning against a hitching post with his horse saddled nearby. "I thought you might like an escort home," he explained, straightening as she approached. "People are still talking about yesterday." "So I've heard from my students," she said with a rueful smile. "Apparently, you shot the robber dead as a doornail." Nathan's lips twitched. "Frontier justice is swift in rumors, if not in fact. Sheriff Davis says the man will stand trial once his shoulder heals. Turns out he's wanted in Colorado as well." They walked slowly toward her house, the evening air cooling after the heat of the day. Nathan kept a respectful distance, yet Penelope was acutely aware of his presence beside her. "Have you eaten?" he asked as they reached her door. She shook her head. "I was planning to make a simple supper." "I could bring something from the hotel restaurant," he offered. "Or, there's a stew simmering at my ranch house. My cook, Mrs. Ramirez, always makes enough to feed an army." The invitation hung between them, unconventional and tantalizing. Propriety dictated she decline. An unmarried woman visiting a bachelor's home would set off a firestorm of gossip in a town like Kelton. Yet after facing death, such concerns seemed trivial. What harm could come from sharing a meal? "I'd like that," she found herself saying. "Let me change first." 20 minutes later, Penelope was seated on Nathan's horse in front of him, his arms around her waist as they rode toward his ranch 3 miles outside of town. The closeness was both awkward and thrilling, his solid presence at her back a reminder of how he'd stepped between her and danger without hesitation. Vance Ranch spread across the valley below them as they crested a hill, much larger than Penelope had realized. A substantial 2-story house stood amid outbuildings and corrals, lamplight glowing welcomingly from its windows. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed. "It's home," Nathan replied simply, guiding his horse down the slope. Inside, the ranch house revealed a different side of Nathan Vance. While not lavish, it was comfortably furnished with quality pieces that suggested prosperity without ostentation. Bookshelves lined his study walls, filled with volumes on cattle breeding, Western exploration, and to her delight literature and history. "You're a reader," she observed, running her fingers along leather-bound spines. "Winter nights are long," he said with a shrug. "And Mrs. Ramirez's son brings catalogs from Denver when he visits. I order what looks interesting." Mrs. Ramirez herself proved to be a cheerful Mexican woman who greeted Penelope warmly and served a delicious stew with fresh bread, giving Nathan a knowing look that made him clear his throat awkwardly. As they ate by lamplight, Penelope found herself relaxing completely for the first time since the robbery. Nathan told her about his ranch operations, his plans for expanding, and his struggles with Eastern cattle buyers who tried to undercut Western prices. "You understand business," she noted with surprise. "Had to learn," he said. "Being good with cattle isn't enough if you can't negotiate fair prices for them." Later, he showed her his prized horses in the stables, introduced her to a litter of puppies born to one of his shepherd dogs, and pointed out constellations as they walked back to the house in the clear night air. It was fully dark when they returned to Kelton, the town mostly quiet except for light and piano music spilling from the saloon. Nathan insisted on walking her to her door despite her assurances that she was perfectly safe. "Yesterday proved nowhere is perfectly safe," he reminded her. "Humor me." At her doorstep, An awkward silence fell between them. Penelope knew she should simply thank him and go inside, but something kept her lingering, reluctant for the evening to end. "I enjoyed tonight," she said finally. "Thank you." Nathan nodded, his expression hidden in shadow. "So did I." He hesitated, then took her hand, his touch gentle despite his calloused fingers. "Penelope, I'm not good with words or social graces, but I'd like to see you again. Properly, if you'll permit it." Her heart quickened. What would properly entail exactly? Sunday dinner at the hotel, perhaps. Or a picnic by the creek when the weather's fine. He paused. "I understand if you'd rather not. A school teacher has her reputation to consider, and I'm just a rancher." "A rancher who reads Shakespeare and can name every constellation in the summer sky," she corrected him softly. "I think I'd like that very much, Nathan." His smile transformed his face, softening the hard angles and making him look younger. Impulsively, Penelope rose on tiptoe and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek, then retreated into her house before her courage failed her, leaving him standing speechless on her porch. Over the next few weeks, Kelton witnessed the unlikely courtship of their schoolteacher and the reclusive rancher. Nathan began appearing at community events he'd previously avoided: church socials, town meetings, even school performances. He donated lumber for new school desks and hired a carpenter to build proper bookshelves for Penelope's classroom. Their Sunday dinners at the hotel became a town fixture, with Mrs. Fleming always reserving the best table by the window. On mild evenings, they took long rides around the countryside, Penelope becoming more confident on horseback under Nathan's patient instruction. Not everyone approved. Some parents questioned whether their schoolteacher should be courting so openly. The banker's wife, who had hoped to match Nathan with her niece from Denver, spread rumors that Penelope had orchestrated the robbery to gain his attention. And Nathan's foreman worried that his distraction would affect ranch operations as autumn roundup approached. Yet the couple remained undeterred, finding in each other qualities long overlooked by others. Penelope discovered that beneath Nathan's reserved exterior lay a man of principle, intelligence, and unexpected tenderness. Nathan, in turn, was captivated by Penelope's courage, her passionate commitment to education, and her willingness to challenge conventional thinking. As summer faded into autumn, their relationship deepened. When the trial of the bank robber approached, Nathan worried about Penelope having to relive the traumatic experience in court. "I'll be there with you," he promised the evening before her testimony was scheduled. They sat on her small porch watching the sunset. "You don't have to face this alone." Penelope leaned against his shoulder. "I know, that makes all the difference." She paused, then added, "He could have killed me, Nathan, or you. Sometimes I wake up thinking about how differently it could have ended." "But it didn't," he reminded her, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "We're here together." The word hung meaningfully between them. The trial itself was brief. The robber, identified as James Hardin, had a long history of similar crimes across Colorado and Wyoming. Penelope's clear, composed testimony, combined with statements from other witnesses, ensured his conviction. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in territorial prison. Afterward, Nathan took Penelope to celebrate at the hotel restaurant, where he seemed unusually nervous, fidgeting with his napkin and barely touching his food. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked. "You've hardly eaten." "Nothing's wrong," he assured her, "just thinking about the future." He met her eyes directly. "Our future, if you'll have one with me." Penelope's breath caught as Nathan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, then moved to kneel beside her chair, oblivious to the restaurant patrons who had fallen silent around them. "Penelope Taylor," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. Before you came into my life, I was existing, not living. You've brought light and purpose to days I once filled with nothing but work. I love you, your courage, your intelligence, your heart. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a gold ring set with a modest but perfectly clear diamond. The restaurant remained hushed, every eye on them as Penelope stared at the ring, then at the man offering it. In that moment, images flashed through her mind of the first time she'd seen Nathan in the bank, gun drawn to protect her, of breakfast at her table with the morning sun highlighting the silver at his temples, of his patience teaching local children to ride during the school picnic, of his face, normally so controlled, breaking into a smile when she appeared. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "Yes, Nathan Vance, I will marry you." Applause erupted around them as Nathan slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to pull her into an embrace that defied propriety but perfectly expressed his joy. Word of their engagement spread through Kelton faster than a prairie fire. Most townsfolk were delighted, having watched the romance unfold over the past months. The school board, after initial reservations about employing a married teacher, agreed that Penelope could continue teaching until the end of the school year. They planned a December wedding, giving them time to prepare while avoiding the worst of winter weather that might prevent guests from attending. Penelope wrote to her family in Boston, expecting disappointment, but receiving instead enthusiastic congratulations and promises to attend despite the arduous journey. "They're curious about the man who could persuade their headstrong daughter to marry," she explained to Nathan as they read the letter together. "Particularly after I turned down 3 perfectly acceptable Boston suitors before coming west. Should I be worried?" he asked, only half joking. Penelope laughed. "Not at all. They'll adore you. My father appreciates men of action rather than words, and my mother will be so relieved I'm finally marrying that she'd accept almost anyone." "Almost anyone," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. She kissed him lightly. "Anyone who looks at me the way you do." As their wedding approached, preparations consumed Kelton. Despite Penelope's protests that she wanted a simple ceremony, the town had decided this would be the social event of the year. The church ladies formed committees for decorations, music, and refreshments. Nathan's ranch hands constructed a dance floor in the town hall. Children from Penelope's school practiced a special song to perform at the reception. The night before her family was due to arrive by train, Penelope found herself restless, walking through town well after most businesses had closed. Without conscious intention, she found herself outside the bank where she and Nathan had first truly seen each other. "Penny for your thoughts, Miss Taylor." She turned to find Sheriff Davis approaching, making his evening rounds. "Just remembering," she said, gesturing toward the bank. "Strange how something so terrifying led to something so wonderful." The sheriff nodded. "Life works that way sometimes." "By the way, got a telegram today you might find interesting. That fellow Hardin, the one who held you hostage, tried to escape during transport to prison. Got himself shot in the process." "Is he dead?" Penelope asked, surprised by her lack of emotion at the news. "No, but he'll spend the rest of his sentence in the prison infirmary." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Thought you should know. Consider it an early wedding present. You won't have to worry about him showing up in Kelton again." After he continued on his rounds, Penelope remained standing outside the bank, contemplating how a single moment of violence had altered the course of her life. Had she arrived a few minutes earlier or later that day, had Nathan not chosen that moment to conduct his banking business, their paths might never have intersected in a meaningful way. The next morning brought the arrival of the Boston Taylors, her parents, 2 younger sisters, and brother all dressed in traveling clothes that marked them immediately as Easterners despite the dust of travel. Penelope's mother embraced her tearfully while her father assessed the town with barely concealed skepticism. "So this is Kelton," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "It's very Western." "That's where we are, Father, the West," Penelope replied with affectionate exasperation. "You'll grow to appreciate its charms. I'm reserving judgment until I meet this rancher of yours," he said, though his expression softened as he hugged her. "You look well, Penny, happy." "I am happy," she assured him, "happier than I've ever been." She had arranged for her family to stay at the hotel, knowing her small house couldn't accommodate them all. As they settled in, Penelope anxiously awaited Nathan's arrival for the dinner they had planned to introduce him to her family. When he appeared at the hotel restaurant that evening, Penelope barely recognized him. Gone was his usual practical attire, replaced by a well-tailored suit she'd never seen before. His dark hair was freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, and he carried a bouquet of wildflowers for her mother and fine cigars for her father. His transformation wasn't lost on her family. Her sisters exchanged appreciative glances. Her brother seemed impressed by Nathan's firm handshake, and even her father's expression thawed as Nathan respectfully answered his probing questions about the ranch's operations and profitability. "You've done well for yourself, young man," Mr. Taylor finally acknowledged over dessert, "though I still question the wisdom of my daughter living so far from civilization." "With respect, sir," Nathan replied evenly. "I believe Penelope is helping bring civilization to Kelton, not running from it. Her work with the school has transformed this community." His defense of her choices silenced her father and earned a grateful smile from Penelope. After dinner, as they walked her family back to their rooms, her mother drew her aside. "He's not what I expected," she admitted quietly. "When you wrote about a cattle rancher, I imagined someone rougher, less educated." "Nathan is full of surprises," Penelope said. "That's part of why I love him." Her mother squeezed her hand. "I can see that he adores you, which is all I've ever wanted for you. Your father will come around completely by the wedding, I'm sure of it." The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, with just enough snow on the distant mountains to create a picturesque backdrop without hindering travel. The small church was transformed with evergreen boughs, ribbons, and candles that filled the space with a warm glow. In the schoolhouse that served as her dressing room, Penelope's sisters helped her prepare, arranging her hair and adjusting the simple but elegant ivory gown ordered from Denver. Her mother fastened her grandmother's pearl necklace around her throat, tears shimmering in her eyes. "You make a beautiful bride," she said, kissing Penelope's cheek. "I only wish your grandmother could see you now." A knock at the door announced her father's arrival to escort her to the church. His eyes widened at the sight of her. "My little girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All grown up and making a life so far from home." "Not so far," she corrected gently. "Just different." He offered his arm. "Your young man is waiting, and if his expression when I left him is any indication, he's as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Penelope laughed at her proper Boston father adopting Western expressions. "Then we shouldn't keep him waiting." The church fell silent as she entered on her father's arm. Candlelight illuminated the faces of friends, students, and townspeople who had become her Western family. But Penelope saw only Nathan, standing tall at the altar, his eyes never leaving her as she walked toward him. The ceremony itself was a blur of emotion, the minister's words, their exchanged vows, the weight of the gold band Nathan placed on her finger joining her engagement ring. What Penelope remembered most clearly was the moment they were pronounced husband and wife. and Nathan kissed her with a tenderness that made the assembled guests sigh collectively. The celebration afterward spilled from the town hall into the street, as it seemed all of Kelton and the surrounding ranches had come to mark the occasion. There was dancing, feasting, and even fireworks arranged by Nathan's ranch hands. Penelope's students presented them with a handmade quilt, each square decorated with scenes from their courtship. "They've been working on it for months," explained Emma Carter proudly. "Mrs. Jameson helped us with the sewing, but we did the pictures ourselves." As the evening progressed, Nathan drew Penelope away from the festivities to a quiet corner. "Happy Mrs. Vance?" he asked, the name still new and wonderful to both of them. "Incredibly," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I'm looking forward to some peace and quiet after all this excitement." "About that," he said mysteriously, "I have a surprise for you." He led her outside where a carriage waited, decorated with ribbons and a "just married" sign clearly painted by his ranch hands. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled. They had planned to spend their wedding night at the ranch before her family departed on the morning train. "Our chariot," he explained with a grin. "I've arranged for your family to visit the ranch tomorrow for lunch instead of breakfast. Tonight, we're going somewhere special." Curious, Penelope allowed him to help her into the carriage. They traveled for nearly an hour, leaving Kelton behind and following a road she didn't recognize in the moonlight. Finally, they turned onto a lane that led to a small cabin nestled among pines at the edge of a meadow. Light glowed from the windows, and as they approached, Penelope could see smoke curling from the chimney. Nathan helped her down, then swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was warm and inviting. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Candles illuminated a table set for two with wine and covered dishes, and through an open door, she glimpsed a bedroom with a large four-poster bed adorned with fresh linens. "What is this place?" she asked, turning to take it all in. "Our place," Nathan said, watching her reaction carefully. "I bought the land last year but never developed it. When you agreed to marry me, I had the cabin built as a surprise, somewhere we can escape when we need solitude." Tears filled her eyes at the thoughtfulness of his gift. "It's perfect." "There's more," he said, leading her to the window where, in daylight, she would have a view of the meadow and distant mountains. "In spring, we'll break ground for the school right there." "A school?" she repeated, confused. "A proper school for the children of ranch workers who live too far from town," he explained, "with a house for the teacher beside it. I thought, perhaps you'd like to continue teaching, even after we have children of our own someday. This way, you wouldn't have to choose between family and your calling." Penelope stared at him, overwhelmed by the depth of understanding his gift represented. Nathan had not only accepted her independence and professional ambitions rare enough in a husband, but had created a way for her to maintain them within their marriage. "You," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "are an extraordinary man, Nathan Vance." His arms encircled her waist. "I'm a fortunate man who found an extraordinary woman and had sense enough to recognize it." Their kiss deepened, unhurried now that they were finally alone as husband and wife. The dinner on the table was temporarily forgotten as Nathan led her toward the bedroom, both of them eager to begin this new chapter of their lives. 5 years later, Penelope sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching her husband teach their 3-year-old son Thomas to ride his first pony. Beside her, their infant daughter Elizabeth slept peacefully in her cradle, one tiny hand curled around her mother's finger. The ranch had prospered under Nathan's management, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the territory. The cabin in the woods had indeed become their retreat. while the Meadow School now educated 15 children from surrounding ranches, with Penelope teaching 3 days a week while her assistant handled the remaining days. Her family visited each summer, her father now an enthusiastic advocate for Western development and her mother doting on her grandchildren. Even her siblings had caught the Western fever. Her brother had established a law practice in Denver, while her youngest sister was courting a banker from Salt Lake City. Life wasn't without challenges. Drought had threatened their cattle 2 summers ago, and last winter's blizzard had been the worst in memory. Yet through each crisis, their partnership had strengthened, each contributing their particular skills and supporting the other. As she watched Nathan lift their laughing son higher on the pony, Penelope reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. That terrible day in the bank, when she'd felt the cold press of a gun against her temple and seen death as a distinct possibility, had ultimately led to the greatest happiness she'd ever known. Nathan looked up, catching her gaze across the yard, and smiled the same smile that still made her heart quicken after all these years. He said something to Thomas, then led the pony toward the porch. "Mama, look," Thomas called excitedly. "I'm riding like Papa." "I see that," she replied, returning his beaming smile. "You're becoming quite the horseman." Nathan lifted the boy down, then sat beside Penelope, his arms slipping naturally around her shoulders as Thomas ran off to find his favorite toy horse. "What were you thinking just now?" he asked, noting her contemplative expression. "You looked miles away." "I was thinking about how life can change in an instant," she said, leaning against him. "How a moment of terror became the beginning of all this." She gestured to encompass their home, their children, the life they'd built together. Nathan's expression grew serious. "Do you ever regret it, coming west, marrying a rancher instead of some cultured Boston gentleman?" It was a question he still asked occasionally, as if part of him couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Penelope turned to face him fully. Taking in the face, she knew better than her own the lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the touch of gray at his temples that had spread over the years, the steadfast blue eyes that had never wavered in their devotion. "Not for a single moment," she assured him, meaning it completely. "My life began the day you walked into that bank, Nathan Vance." He kissed her then, a kiss that held the memory of their first embrace, the joy of their wedding day, the wonder of their children's births, and the promise of all the years stretching before them. In the distance, the school bell rang, signaling the end of the day's lessons. Soon, the ranch would be busy with workers returning, children playing, and the evening routine they had established together. But for now, in this quiet moment on their porch, they were simply a man and woman who had found in each other the courage, partnership, and love that transformed 2 separate lives into one shared journey. As baby Elizabeth stirred and opened her eyes blue like her father's, Penelope gathered her close, grateful for the fullness of her heart and the life that had emerged from that fateful day in Kelton's bank, where a desperate man's crime had inadvertently united 2 souls who might otherwise never have truly seen each other. "I love you," Nathan murmured against her hair. "And I love you," she replied. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after, it was enough. It was everything.